Thank you, Monica. All right, welcome back. I hope you got up and stretch your legs and have something to drink. Um, so we got our warm-up case already for the morning, and now we're going to have a more analytical type of case, because we have learned the importance of randomization in when we talked about A/B tests. You got um, to use some of the knowledge that you have already acquired in terms of statistical testing, understanding what a p-value is, and so on. And now we are going to dig a little bit deeper into the concept of statistical matching, which is actually one of the leading topics in statistics and in causal inference that have, really attracted the interest of statisticians in the last 30 years. Causal inference really started from the studies of a group at Harvard, and still one of the leading centers, Harvard, for causal inference. And the goal is, how can we identify a causal relationship when we observe something in reality? It can be an effect of a treatment, but it can also be the effect of an intervention, of a promotion, as we have seen in the previous case, and so on. So we said in the past that, in the past case, that randomization is very important for causal analysis. And it's pretty much the gold standard to avoid erroneous or skewed results in our experiments. And when we can randomize, we should randomize. In the example that we have seen before, randomization was something that came very natural, because you had, first of all, a huge population, and there were not really ethical considerations in terms of administering that deal. It's not really, you're not really impacting anybody if you don't give the deal to somebody. It's just a small type of incentive. However, in certain cases, randomization could actually be impossible or unfeasible. And it might be even unethical to use randomization in certain instances. Also, financial constraints can be also a serious issue. So, what can we do when we cannot can you please make Zoom the case? Oh, yes, let me see. Okay, let me see if I could. I think that this is the best that I can do in terms of zooming in the. Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, thank you. So yeah, it works. Perfect. Thank you. But Matteo, no, there was not the formula for the sample size. We can talk about it later. What I was telling you, it was about the standard error. We can talk about it later. But yeah, it's not a formula for the sample size. The formula for a standard error depends on the sample size. But yeah, we can talk about it later. Let's start importing the parts that we need for the case. And let's give a business context. It's not really business in this case, but it's more the real life scenario. The title of the case is, Do Prison Reform Programs Reduce Recidivism? So recidivism is a measure of a former prisoner's likelihood to be rearrested, reconvicted, or returned to prison, with or without a new sentence, during a 3-year period following the prisoner's release. So the incarcerated person that is released from prison, if they get rearrested or reconvicted or resentenced within 3 years, then they are considered to be, to be doing it again. So that's what recidivism is. And there are many reasons that can impact the percentage of recidivism. Each country has different, how to say, laws in place. And I can tell you that in the United States, people that get released from prison, they have a hard time finding jobs because a lot of places do not want to employ them. And even a well-meaning person that doesn't want to make the same mistake again, sometimes just because of societal issues and about, the landscape that they find when they get out of prison, they are more likely to reoffend just because they are not given really the appropriate way to re-enter society. So there are, and this is why in the US, recidivism is quite high. More than 60% of released incarcerated people are reoffending with 3 years of release, which makes you think that something is not right, something needs to be fixed. So prison reform programs have invested hundreds of millions of dollars per year on programs designed to try to reduce reoffense. However, implementing these programs is costly, and how to evaluate them can be complex. So project evaluation is one of the areas where matching is very important, because the question that we want to ask is, if we implement this program, is it effective at reduce recidivism, for instance? Currently, policymakers are interested in evaluating a training program designed to reduce recidivism among paroled inmates. These are inmates that are given parole. So given the possibility of serving a discount sentence or complete their sentence outside of prison. And you are the person that has been consulted by the policymaker to determine whether or not this program is working. Why is it important to determine if it's working? Well, beyond the ethical and sociological implications, we need to consider also the burden in terms of cost for the finances for the government, because these programs are very costly, and if we are using taxpayers' money to invest, we want to make sure that they are actually effective. So the question is, will there be a reduction in recidivism if the proposed program were to be widely adopted? Notice that the question is not establishing a specific target in terms of reduction. It's just wondering if there is a statistical reduction in recidivism after the program has been adopted widely. So this is the business context. The analytical context is, so here we learn a little bit about the data that we have. The new program was piloted for a subset of recently released prisoners from 2 prisons. So it's a small sample, relatively small in terms of number of prisons. And the new parolees at these 2 prisons were given the option to volunteer to participate in this program. So you cannot force somebody to participate to a program. And this is why randomization in this case would be completely unethical, because it's not part of their sentence to be forced to attend this program. So this is a typical example for which the randomization cannot be implemented, and this is why we need to consider other ways to implement in our experiment. So if the program is effective for this subsample, then it would be scaled up to all parolees from 25 eligible prisons in the federal penal system. So we are considering here the federal system, not the state system. So the case is structured as follows. Jaime is mentioning self-selection. Well, that's an excellent, it's an excellent point. However, self-selection in this case, I can think, and probably you all can give me further input. Self-selection can go both ways. Number one, people who join the program are the ones that actually are making an attempt to do better. But there are people that perhaps have already decided that they don't need the program and that they have already decided to change their life. So they decide that they do not want to attend the program. So it could be like, a contrasting effect in terms of selection. Oscar, what would be the difference between skewed results and biased results? In this case, I would treat them as equivalent expressions, okay? So in the case, this is what we are going to do today. First, we will analyze the setup of the program and correctly identify potential observational study designs problems. So how do we implement the design for this project evaluation? And then we learn about matching and use it to correct for some of these problems. And finally, conduct exploratory data analysis to determine which features seem to account for most of the corrections between the policymaker study and our matched study. All right, so initial analysis of the program. The program was focused on vocational training and coping skills. So basically, we are trying to teach the inmates to be released some skills that can help them find some jobs. And also coping skills. Coping skills means skills that can help them to navigate stress, pain, other frustration, other things that perhaps led them to commit a crime in first place. So the program was implemented in the southeastern United States between 2013 and 2015, and it was applied to 7,105 people. Participants were followed for 30 months after completing the program and identified as a responder if they did not recommit a crime, and as a non-responder, that is, the program didn't work if they did. So the data is the following form. So we're going to talk a little bit about the algebra and the algebraic notation, because we're going to have some of it. You already scrolled down your file, you would have seen that there are some of these formulas, but they are nothing to be worried about. So we have couplets of data, pairs of data, x1 and y1, x2 and y2, where xi is a vector containing several characteristics for the parolee I. So I, the index I here is indicating the individual prisoner to be released. And x is each prisoner has a set of variables that determine their case. Okay, so it's information about each one of the prisoners. And yi is the response variable that denotes whether or not that person was a responder. One means that they did not recommit a crime, and 0 if they, okay, so let me see, because here there is actually a little bit discrepancy in notation. We have to, because a responder in this case would be a 0, that the prisoner did not reoffend, and 1, it means that they reoffended, and so they are a non-responder. So let's be careful that, remember, a responder, it means that the program worked, so they did not commit a crime, and then the variable is equal to 0. The variable will be equal to 1 if they are a non-responder. Means that the program didn't work for them and they recommitted a crime. And these are the variables that we have. First of all, we have an ID, which is the unique prisoner identifier. So this is like just a tag number. Of course, we cannot have names in this type of data. We will have just IDs, right? For privacy reasons. Max severity. So this is the severity of most serious charges in the current conviction. Several inmates might have more than one conviction that they are serving for. So we have the maximum severity of the charges in that specific conviction, and then the average severity. You know, for instance, since we are talking about federal crimes, yeah, we might see more serious offenses, and perhaps, you know, if somebody has committed, I don't know, physical violence, there might be different sub crimes that they were committed in the process. And so there is an indication of how serious the charges were. So we have the maximum severity of the charges and the average severity for that specific conviction. And these variables are on a scale from 1 to 5, okay? With 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest. Then we have the sentence time. That is the sentence, the amount of time that they have to spend in jail, and how much they have served until that point, okay? Then we have education. It's coded from 1 to 4. So 1 is less than high school, 2 high school diploma, 3 some college, and 4 a college degree. So repeated offender, here we are looking already, remember, these inmates might have already been in jail multiple times. So the repeat offender checks whether or not the parolee has been charged before with a similar conviction. Then we have substance use, whether or not that person was an abuser of some substances, and then support. This is the binary indicator that the parolee is being provided with transitional support. That is, if they are getting some services that help them to, you know, to transition back into society. For instance, a halfway house. Think they are structures that host them, host people that are recently released from jail, to give them time to find a job and find another living accommodation. So they are not just thrown away on the streets. Remember, a lot of these people might not even be in touch with their families. And unfortunately, when people are released from prison, sometimes they find themselves homeless, and it's really a big challenge for them, even when they want to be, you know, good members of society. Becomes very, very challenging. Maria, what is the time served? Is the amount of time that they had spent in prison until that point. So let's start opening the data, and which is called recstudy.csv, and we are going to start exploring the first 5 rows of the data set. So for the severity of charges, I think that this is, I'm not sure, Laura, how it was actually measured, but we have, the idea should be that the maximum severity should be something that goes from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest. So it's basically an indication of the severity. And this could be highly subjective, of course, but it doesn't change much in terms of our analysis if we just know that 5 means the more serious crimes and 1 the less serious crimes. So, for instance, here we have subject 0, subject 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we're going to see more details about this analysis. So just the so here, yes, here this the time should be. I'm thinking that the time should be in the number of months that have been served, but I could be wrong. See, yeah, the length is in months. Okay. No, it would not be years, because otherwise, yeah, here we would be dealing with people that were assigned. They're already 38 years in prison. That would be very, very long. But they're months. And in fact, you can see, for instance, for this person, the sentence time was 19 months. Okay. And notice that there is an increase for when the severity is higher, also the sentence time is higher. So this person was basically 60 months, that's 5 years in prison for a severity, for a maximum severity of 2. Okay. For somebody who has the maximum severity of 1, we can see that the sentence is more 1 to 1.5 years. Okay. No, there is not seem to be age of the offender, but that would be definitely a variable that could be interesting to consider. I completely agree with. So, exercise 1. What is one potential issue you see with the program design that might dilute the conclusiveness of your results? Okay, selection bias, we mentioned that before, could be one of the why sentence time is a fraction and not a whole number? Because sometimes sentences are given in days, and sometimes, yeah, so it can actually be a little bit complicated, and you might have that you have more than one charge that are a little bit different in length, and then when you sum them up, they end up being a little bit different. That's why it's not a whole number that are. Andres, always possible to have incomplete information on the socioeconomic characteristics of the parolee, which might be determining factor in recidivism. Yes, I agree. Grouping could compare 2 types of crime that affect the, yes, that's also a possibility. That's why perhaps we need a larger, yeah. Herman, I think it's important to have the time to yeah, well, you know, in this case, they are just looking at a window of time just based on the definition of what recidivism is. So this person, for instance, is also, we see that is not a repeat offender. So it was not in jail already, while this person was. And this person is a person with a substance problem. It's also receiving support, as also an education level of 1. That means that they have completed high school. And this is if they end up reoffending or not. Okay. So you raise some valid points. And they are connected with the idea that joining the program was voluntary. The study sample in the experiment was not randomized. Of course, we cannot randomize in this case. Thus, care must be taken in generalizing any observed effect in the participating parolees, right? Just because we are not randomizing, and there could be some self-selection bias, and we need to consider what, again, it can go both ways, the selection bias. It might skew the results in both ways. And this is why we should consider what can we do in terms of matching. All right, exercise 2. Dorian, the data set is different to what is on the parolee characteristics table. No, it should be the same. Support, education, repeated offender. Yeah, they're the same. So these are the X variables on the table. The only additional column that you have is the reoffend. That's your Y variable. And yeah, and the unique ID, I suppose, is just this 0, 1, 2, etc. Yeah, reoffend, Anna Maria, is the Y variable, which is if in the 30 months after being released from jail, if they are reoffending. Okay. So some of the questions that I'm seeing are very valid, but we are going to see more of it. What are we evaluating and so on? Those are questions that they will be answered as we go on the case. So this is the data set that we have, and yes, is not by no means is complete with everything that we would like to have. But let's work with this, right? Jacqueline, if the participants are volunteers, there would be a bias? Yes, of course. And this is why we have to try to mitigate that bias. And the instrument that we are going to use will be matching. We'll see what it is, okay? So exercise 2 asks you, conduct a basic exploratory data analysis to see if any of the covariates appear to be related to the probability of reoffense. What is the average rate of reoffense of the participants in the study? Anna Maria, repeated offender is the same as reoffend? No, repeated offender was somebody that reoffended in the past, okay? Somebody that was in jail again for something, for another conviction, okay? The ones that are not reoffenders are people that are in prison for the first time. So this is before the study was implemented, okay? So what is the average rate of reoffense of the participants of the study? Danielle, the participants are being released from prison. So they are parolees, they have received parole. That is that they are given the possibility of exiting and they can join this program. All right, so let's start with the basic exploratory data analysis. By the way, I always enjoy when, if you're able to open the file and start looking at it yourself when you post the plots and results on Slack. I always like to see it. Just we have a lot to cover today. So all the variables that we have, they are either numerical with clear directionality in their labels. Some of them that are categorical, like education. Yes, it's categorical, but is ordinal. So the higher the label number, the more educated the participant is. And so we can start looking at a correlation matrix, right? So if we look at correlation matrix, well, we can start seeing a bit about what the variables that correlate the most with among each other are. For instance, we can see that there is a high correlation between maximum severity and average severity. That's not surprising, right? Because the average is, of course, impacting the maximum. The maximum is impacting the average. Oh, John, nice color map for the correlation matrix. Very good. And of course, sentence time is correlated with maximum severity. You know, the worse the crime it is, the higher the crime. And let's check education. Is education correlated, or does it matter at all with any of these variables? Notice that the correlation is almost zero. It's basically essentially zero with any of the metrics of severity, right? And we can also look at a scatter plot that can give us a visual interpretation. Matteo, education and reoffend is not correlated, could be nonlinear, it could be, but keep in mind that here education is very vaguely defined in the sense that you only have 5 possible values for education. So it's a little bit tricky. Also, chances are that some of the categories might not be that populated or populated as much. So if you have, for instance, very few people with college degrees that are in federal prison, probably you will not have enough representation to actually measure any type of correlation. So yeah, it's actually very tricky to measure. Actually, we can go and check for yeah. So you have, this could be somewhat useful. You can see that there are some of the fan plots that can tell us what. So we have high correlation between sentence served and sentence time. Well, of course, because the sentence served is always less than the sentence time, right? Because it's a proportion of it. Francisco, are these based on real data? Yes, I suppose so. Camilo, it does not require normalization to check a categorical versus. Yes, indeed. We are just starting with some visual inspection of what we can get. Some of this, the information on this plot is, of course, not directly usable. Okay, but let's see what are the things that we can actually save from this. So from this, we can see that the likelihood of reoffense increases with the following variables. So the likelihood of reoffense, remember, is the last row. And so remember that 0 was actually the probability of was that that you will not be reoffending, and 1 that you would be reoffending. So we can see that there are some large correlation between reoffend and maximum severity. Again, it cannot be directly interpreted as a correlation just because the variables are, of course, the likelihood of reoffending is a binary variable. So from what we can see, though, the maximum severity of the crime, so the worst crime that they were committed of, correlates with the likelihood of reoffending and substance use, and whether or not they were a repeated offender before. Well, of course, if somebody was already in the past has already redone the same mistakes, chances are that that it would be more likely to continue in that path. So we also can see that it decreases as the gap between sentence time and time served. Possible explanation. Oh, Luis, you cannot compute the correlation between a continuous variable and a categorical one. Here we are just looking at the likelihood of which ones are the categories that are more present. It's not really a correlation coefficient. And this is why you have to be extremely careful with, we are just looking at signals here, okay? So we are saying, are there more zeros or 1 when we have, in terms of maximum severity and so on, okay? So again, this is, at the moment, is just a very, it's based on intuition. Let's not get quantitative just yet, okay? So a positive gap between sentence time and time serves indicates that the subject was released early. That is, if the person was eligible for parole way before the end of the sentence, it means that they were typically behaving well in prison. So that's considered a sign of goodwill, an active attempt to try to get out of jail as soon as possible and to do better, okay? In fact, if we look at the mean, among the people that reoffended, okay, we are seeing that it's about 0.47%. So the average rate of reoffense is 47.5%, which is much lower than the national average of 60%. So this is a reduction of about 12.5%. Does that mean that the program has worked? If it was true and the program actually worked, then it would mean that it would be something that would be very significant. It would be a very high reduction in crime, and that would provide really good results. The question is, are we capturing the effect of the program, or we are capturing something else? So a reduction of 12.5% would be remarkable if such results held across all prisoners released across the entire prison system. Recall that policymakers are interested in the value of a program if then can be generalized, not just for the pilot program, but for the entire system. So what are the sources of what can go wrong? Why this particular example of 12.5 improvement over the national average might not be a good indicator of what can happen nationally. So what are the difficulties? Okay, Fabian said geographical factors. I completely agree. Matteo, the fact that he may choose to be in the program, right? Henry, if the correlation coefficients between maximum severity and reoffense is negative, aren't we saying that the greater the severity of the offense, the lesser the likelihood of reoffending in this case? Keep in mind that here you are indicating with 0 the lack of reoffense. So, and with 1 you are indicating the possibility of reoffending. So Javier says should be compared to the region average, not the country average. True. Dorian says that the test was done in only 2 prisons. Albert points out that gender issues as well. All of these are valid concerns. There are few other ones. So a major issue is that the type of prisoner who would decide to attend this program is already very scared about future incarceration. And so they have identified a problem and they are already trying to respond, which is the self-selection bias that you were discussing. But also, this prisoner might not be representative of the population of released prisoners because the factors influencing their decision to join the study may influence also their likelihood of response. So if you are already putting effort into joining a program, it means that probably you already don't want to reoffend. You're already concerned enough that you do not want to go back to jail. You probably hate it. You probably don't like it. You're probably trying to get out as soon as possible. The next one is, of course, geographical reasons. But there could be also some specificities that are related to those 2 prisons. For instance, why were those 2 prisons selected and how were they selected? Did the population of those 2 prisons make them already more likely to respond to such programs. And so there is also selection bias in terms of the prisons themselves. And of course, there could be further issues. Typically, these programs get implemented when there is the infrastructure to be able to implement them. And there are some prisons in the United States where these programs become very challenging. And so it's possible that these two prisons had other programs going on at the time. And so the prisoners have already had some kind of exposure to some of the vocational programs that we had discussed before, and that they were already a more, so it would have been more interesting to compare the recidivism percentage to the past years of the same prisons. So not just the national average, but even the local average or even the prison's average. Danielle, that's a good question. I think they are probably low security, and I'm telling you why. Because typically prisons that are high security, they are called penitentiary here in the US. And also, if you're looking at the length of the sentences, they are relatively short sentences, at least for some of the inmates, right? We have seen about a year and a half for some of them. Typically, those are not prisoners in maximum security prisons. We haven't seen like some of the most severe. So again, the other issue that I was mentioning is exactly that, the fact that we only have two prisons that we would be eligible, and this could bias our results. Let's assume now that the sample prisons are not systematically different from the others. So for the sake of argument, Camilo, is the study considering women as well? Yes, I suppose so. Doesn't say anything about it. So of course, yes, I suppose so. So since we cannot correct the fact that the program was only designed for two prisons, let's assume that the prisons were similar enough to the other 23 prisons that were not part of the program. Given the set of prisoners who opt into the program could be biased, suggest three possible approaches to estimate the response rate in the entire population of released prisoners, discussing costs and benefits of these approaches. So I would like you to take a little time on this, because given what you know about key performance indication, designing tests, and so on, how you define the response rate in the entire population of released prisoners, and try to think about costs and benefits for these approaches. So what if you had the possibility of implementing this program in the entire prison system? And I'm going to try to play some music. We haven't done that today at all. Let me try to minimize the sound so it's not too loud. Let me know if it's too loud, okay?
Professor, maybe it's necessary to stop sharing and enable the share sound option before
okay.
sharing.
Sweets geek coffee, seek profit, cook style, eat off it. Think unique, tie, squeak, jewels, bling. The faculty, high peaks, calm sweets. She said I'm too deep, then she fell asleep. How that llama repeat sound hella sweet. Gorgeous dashing, waves crashing, mind elastics, smooth action. The Cadillacs was back then. You may need to get in the trunk.
So try with indirect variables, not direct responses. classification of prisoners. Okay, that would be interesting. If the program remains for volunteer and national level, would not decrease that specific bias, maybe making a survey of intentional participation. That's a very valid point, Juliet. Actually, that's very interesting. Offer the program with some alongside benefits to be more attractive to ex-prisoners. That's good. Randomize the response values as much as possible. The problem is that you cannot really randomize this case. It would be like a discrimination. And also, you cannot force anybody to participate. Matteo, can it be mandatory for everyone? No, you cannot. You cannot make it mandatory for everyone because it will be, impacting the freedom of people. And, in the moment that you are sentenced for something, you still do not lose your rights. So your freedom is only limited by the sentence. So you cannot make it mandatory. I mean, you could make it mandatory for the future, but not for people that are already in the prison system. All right, so let's talk about it. 3 potential approaches. This will also clarify more what the intention of the case was. Number 1, so we run our pilot study and we want to see the effects on the how can we extend it to the national level? 1, you could run up a follow-up study where subjects are randomly enrolled into the program and forced to participate as part of the terms of their release. This would certainly provide a representative sample, but could be extremely costly and would delay implementation of full-scale implementation of the programs. You would see a lot of lawyers, again, suing because there is a limitation of freedom and you cannot really force. It could be put as an incentive for parole. That's a possibility. And interview prisoners to identify factors influencing their decision to enrolling in the study. So why are you enrolling in the study? So trying basically to capture one of the possible confounding variables. And this could be, a way to learn about prisoners' intentions and different biases that could be going on. I know that some of you proposed this in the chat, and it was actually correct. Of course, we cannot know if these same factors will be present in the general population or not. So this would be kind of an example of a confirmation bias, right? So it's very hard to capture this, but it's a meaningful way. But also use the covariate of the prisoners. So the parts that that we used before is well, we know something already about these prisoners. We know the length of the severity. We know if they were already repeated offenders, and that would help us adjust for differences between those that are enrolled in the study and those that are not. So in order to determine whether or not this program will work at the federal level, at the general level, using some of these covariates can help us to generalize the effect, okay? Andreas, probably off topic, but I think that social related challenges are really complex to evaluate based only on statistical analysis, quantifying variables. Oh yes, of course. I mean, there are many things that play a role. With social studies, it's always tricky to be exact and precise. And this is why we try to intercept trends and so on, and then look at the big picture. It's not simple. It's not simple. It's not like a physics experiment or a chemical experiment. So how can we reduce the selection bias? How can we reduce the fact that we are looking at two specific prisons, and how can this help us in generalizing? So for this, we need to introduce the idea of matching, how to make the treatment group and the control group more comparable, less biased. The core idea of matching is to group untreated individuals with treated individuals. That is, to try to find similar individuals according to certain characteristics that are present in both groups. For instance, we want that group A and group B to be similar in terms of education composition. We do not want, let's say, group A to be formed by only by the ones that the prisoners that have high level of education, and group B the opposite. We want to have similar proportions. In that sense, we are creating groups that are comparable. Or we also want a range or a distribution of severity of offense that is comparable. And of course, this is tricky because we have several variables that we have to consider. And this is not a large data set. Imagine how hard it is when you have hundreds of variables that you need to use for matching. So first of all, the question would be, which variables would you like to use? So it's actually tricky to determine which variables you should be using for matching. And then you can always run into issue of a small sample size, because depending on the variables, you might have only very few individuals with certain characteristics. Assume that in addition to the in-study data, we have external data that are designed in the same way. So you still have a set of characteristics and a response from a larger population, 55,799, that were released during the period that either opt out from the study, so they did not want to participate, or they were not eligible because they were from some of the other prisons. So this is the so-called control group, right? However, there are two different types of control here, of course. You have the ones that opt out of the program, right? That were given the chance to volunteer and they chose not to. And then you have inmates from other prisons that were never given the chance. Maybe they would have taken it if they were given it. So this is so we have a group of prisoners that indeed attended the program voluntarily. And then we have a group of prisoners from other prisons that were never given the chance, and some from the two prisons of interest that were given the chances, but they did not want to. So the in-study data, we have X1 and Y1, Xn and Yn, N, remember, was the sample size for the two prisons, and M is the sample size from the outside group, and the group that did not want to volunteer. Informally, for each out of the study prisoner J, so with I we indicate the ones that are part of the study, and J the ones that are not part of the study, we have a vector of characteristics xj. Our objective is to find a prisoner I from the study with characteristics xi, so that xi and xj are as close as possible. Keep in mind that if you were looking at just one variable, this would be relatively easy, right? But here you're looking at multiple variables at the time. So we have to try to determine a distance metric between the matrix xi and the matrix xj. This will help us to have comparable groups. So what's the distance that we can use? One, there are different choices. typically, especially when you have continuous variables, the Euclidean distance is the most intuitive. So imagine that you have two vectors, x and x prime, with p characteristics, okay? The Euclidean distance, which, by the way, in 2 dimensions is very simple, is essentially the Pythagorean theorem that determines like the distance. Here, Luis is saying not all the variables are in the same unit. That is correct, but here we will be comparing only pairs of variables that are within the same, that are the same variables. So for instance, x1 and x1 prime will be, I don't know, education. x2 could be the length of sentence. x3 could be the time served. And you are comparing the distance between a prisoner in the system, in the program, and the prisoner that was not in the program. So we can calculate this distance. And we want this distance to be as small as possible. So we are trying to minimize the distance according to all these different components. So we are trying to find the best compromise, okay? So there are different matching strategies that we can use. Viviana is asking, do we have to have a match for each participant in the treatment group? There are different ways to do matching. There is one-to-one matching, and it really depends on the size of your treatment group and your control group. There is also the possibility of having more than one match from the control group for the same match from the treatment group if you have more control. So there are different ways, okay? In this particular case, for each one of the out of the study prisoner, we need to find an in-study prisoner. So the same in-study prisoner could be a match for multiple people on the outside group, okay? And we will discuss also the issues related to, you know, comparing variables and normalizing and so on. But bear with me for now. Remember, though, that the issue of different units will not appear within this parenthesis because each variable will be the same. We will make sure that that the distance will be, you know, would be appropriately normalized. So this form of matching is called nearest neighbor one matching. That is, we are finding the single individual match that minimizes this distance. Nearest neighbor, we are defining a neighbor according to multiple dimensions here. So we are not just in 2D, we are in high dimensions. So the characteristics of the out-of-study prisoners are in a separate file. And so we found the first data set was the recidivism study, which is recstudy.csv. And let's read it into a data frame called in-study data, and then call the other file as out-of-study data. So all we are doing here is we are reading directly from the CSV files. And we are importing, giving it data frames names, in-study data, and outside and out-of-study data. So in terms of scaling, we want to, since yes, we are in different dimensions, but the distance that we are calculating is just one. We want to be able to scale properly the features of our data. It's not just the unit of measure that is changing. Something we're asking, they are in different units. It's not just the unit of measure, it's also the scale, the variability. Remember that you have months that can go up to 70, 80, or even more. And let's say education that just goes from 0 to 5. So if we do not scale the data, education is going to have a very, very small weight compared to the distance component that is due to sentence served and so on. So we need somewhat to renormalize this data. And we have different choices to normalizing it. We can either do the min-max normalization or the standardization and scaling to unit length. So normalization is one of the typical things that is done when you subtract the mean and you divide by the standard deviation. So you solve the problem of scale. Here we will scale each feature so that the columns of our data have unit length. That's another choice. You might want to say, well, we want that the columns have maximum value of 1. So to normalizing it, you use the extension numpy.linearlog. And if you perform like this short sequence of code, we are taking the first 9 columns of the data for the in-study data and for the out-study data, and we are normalizing it with respect to the using the norm function that we have here. So let's take 100 random out of study prisoner to merge in our data and make a simple scatter plot. So we select 10 random subjects and we merge the data so into a data frame that contains both the out of study data and the in study data, and we are applying for all this combined data set a random subset. Okay. And then we plot the sentence time and the average severity feature of the prisoners. And we have here a scatter plot that actually looks at the probability of reoffend. And we have 0, 1, and 2. If we judge only by the sentence time versus the sentence served features, so we have sentence time on the x-axis and sentence served on the y-axis, there are a few out of study prisoners which could consider as potential reoffenders, right? And which are the ones that are closer to the orange dot. It's not sure that it's quite visible here. Also because there is not an orange, dot. So in this part here, you can probably tell that the blue dots and the light blue dots are actually quite separated. But however, on this part of the plot, so for shorter sentence times, is actually much harder to tell apart. Yeah, there are no orange dots, Rubiel. This is I don't see the orange dots either. We probably we need to, we'll make a note for this and revise this case. And yes, I agree that we should probably use also symbols for those of us that are colorblind. So it's hard to tell from this plot alone how to isolate the possible reoffenders from those that are not. Sometimes, and we're going to see now how matching can play a role for us to help deciphering this. Sometimes we have to do for loops, even though when they are not efficient, to get and this is a little bit of an aside. And for loops will be useful for us to actually search possible matches. And this is a simple example of how to implement a for loop. It's not necessarily the most efficient routine. Most of the times, these routines are implemented within some of the Python functions. However, this will give us a little bit of an idea of how long it will take to run. That is to compare all the possible pairs, because this is a problem that can be computationally very intensive, because you have to calculate the distance out of many, many thousands or hundreds of thousands of possible comparisons between each prisoner with each other, right? So in order to minimize that distance. Take care of this. So if you run it, you will see that it will take a given number of seconds. So, and how can this be helpful? In this case, is of course stopping at 50,000, and we are printing just a number of iterations. Here is asking you to write code to create the match data set for the first 10,000 rows of the normalized out of sample data using the normalized in study data. It may take a while to run, so you may use the function to track your progress. Once you have completed the matching, compute the estimated matched mean. So we're going to do it together. So you could run a loop using the function, and it could be very expensive, but there is some matrix manipulation that we can use in this case. Now, if X is an n by k matrix, remember, n is the number of the in-study prisoners, and k is the number of characteristics, and Y is an m by k matrix. So you have m is the outside of the study prisoners, and k is the number of characteristics. They are the same. The number of columns are the same for both matrices. The square Euclidean distance between the ith row of X and the jth row of Y equals the ij entry of this matrix. So we would have to take the norm of the matrix X times a vector of ones. How big is the vector of ones? Well, it will be a vector with m ones, and this will be a row vector. Notice that you have the transposition term minus 2 times X, which again, X is the matrix of characteristics for the in-study, times Y, which is, why can I make this multiplication? Because if I take the transpose of Y, I'm multiplying something that has the same number of rows, would be K, as the number of columns of X. Remember, when you take the transposition, the columns and the rows are inverted. Plus ones, n, this is a vector of ones of size n, times the norm of Y transpose. So the function norm is the vector of square norms for each row of X. Okay, so it gives you a vector. And we can actually implement this by the, so we take the study outcome. The study outcome, of course, would be the last column, which was the reoffend column, right? So that's the vector of zeros and ones that will determine whether or not an inmate will be a responder or a non-responder. Then we compute our matrix X and our matrix Y. Notice that before, in the case, Y was denoting the outcome, but here we are really calling the covariates or the characteristics of the out of study prisoners. We are creating some vectors of ones, one of size n and one of size m. And then we calculate the norms, because the norms are the parts that will be consistently needed when we calculate the distance. And then we finally implement the formula that we have here. So the shape of this matrix of distances would be 7,105 times 10,000. And now let's calculate the match. So the matches will be stored into these objects that, interestingly enough, is called match with an S, but not the E, but okay, matches. And our goal then will be to calculate the percentage of out-of-study population that will reoffend after the matching. So this will give us a more comparable group compared to the national average, okay? So we will store this mean in the matched mean. And then, of course, we will have to look at the minimum value across each column, because remember, we want to minimize the distance. So we calculate a vector where we extract the jth column from the matrix M. We take the minimum, we check which one is the minimum, and then we calculate the match. And we go and, how do we calculate the mean here? Well, it would basically, we check by summing up the vector of the outcome, the study outcome. So when you have something that adds up, you have a binary variable that's up 1 each time, you are essentially calculating the proportion, right? If you divide then by the sample size. So the matched mean, which will be the sum of the individual outcomes, will be divided by M, which is the sample size for the out of the program group. So it runs for a bit. I already ran it for you. And the mean of the reoffense after matching is about 55%. So we can see that the results from the estimated benefits to the population outside the study was much worse compared to the in-study population. So if we are matching the outside with the inside, and then we go and check how effective it was, we say, oh, well, you know, it's actually not that good. It's 55%. And is very close to being on par with the average among the untreated, which was 60% overall. So we might actually be a little bit hesitant about recommending this program, because we would have just a match, we would have just an efficacy of a reduction in about 5%, which is not necessarily as good as we would have liked. So there was indeed a selection bias, okay? Although 5% reduction might be still appreciable, you know, if, however, there are other things that could go wrong and might not justify the cost for a reduction that is only 5%. And again, this is a prediction, so it comes with uncertainty. And this is a common problem in these types of studies. So let's see if we can improve things a bit and understand why the results are so different. And we will also learn about ways how to improve our matching criteria. Brian, always look for the vectorized solutions over cycles and iterations. It will be a lot time faster. Yes, Brian, that's correct. Because that's what I was suggesting, that the the inside routines of Python are vectorized. So you don't have to run a loop outside. So the loop is somewhat internal. You don't see it. It's a system that allows you to treat a vector automatically, and is considerably faster. Make sure that we are on track with time. I think, yes, we have about 50 minutes, so we're doing good with time. So to begin, let's consider inclusion in the study as a binary classification problem, where a subject is labeled as 1 if they are included in the study and 0 if they were not. Okay, so keep in mind that we have a slightly different different indication from what we had before. Before, with 0 and 1, we were indicating the whether or not the individual was a respondent versus a non-respondent. Nicholas, yeah, I get that the mathematical formulation might be a little bit confusing, but I think that, given the interest of time, I think it's better that we, we focus on the intuition, and then we can go and refine, the algebra. I know that not everybody has a strong exposure to linear algebra, but it goes to say that what linear algebra does by performing operations on vectors is to it can actually help us to speed up computation. So you're doing things in a more direct way instead of looping up and consider all possible cross products and comparisons and so on. So to explore differences in the study and non-study populations, we can consider building a model that predicts whether or not a subject was in the study using their baseline covariance. So basically, it's a simulation type of approach, right? So it will be building a predictive model. And let's start by building some basic exploratory data analysis and look at the distribution of the covariance. So let's start by creating a new column on both the data sets that is called sample indicator. This column should take the value 1 when the subject is coming from the study, and 0 from the subject that is not coming from the study. And we make a unique data set using the outer merge. Note, since we are looking at distributions right now, we do not want to use the normalized data at this point, okay? Remember, we use the normalized data to calculate the distances. But right now, we are actually looking at differences in certain features between the out of study and the in study. So were the populations even comparable to begin with? Why is not the success of the program is not generalizable, at least at a first glance? So take a little time, and perhaps let's start looking at the distribution of some of the variables, and let's see if they are comparable. So I'm going to give you few minutes to look at this. Anybody was able to produce some initial graphs about the distribution of the characteristics? Oh, Angie, can we go back a little? I don't understand how the reoffense increased so much after matching. That is the reoffense of the group that was treated. No, this is the reoffense of the group that was not treated, but that was matched according to the group that was treated. All right, so let's start by merging the two data sets. And we're going to start with the first 10,000 rows just because the we want to keep calculations reasonable, okay? And we import both data sets and we merge them into one, and then we create an additional column that denotes whether or not that entry was coming from the study data set or the out of study data set. So it will be 1 for the in-study data set and 0 for the out of study data set. And we call it data frame merged, okay? By using the function merge, and it's called outer, okay? And we are going to display the first 4 rows, the first 5 rows, and the last 5 as well. Okay, so notice that the reoffend category here is not present for the outside. Okay, and and we have an indication here that basically tells us which data set it's coming from. So we have a total of 17,100 rows and 10 columns. And then we create 2 plots, a box plot of maximum severity for the 2 data sets and density plot for maximum severity for each severity bucket. Severity, remember, was a value from 1 to 5 for the 2 data sets. So basically, we are looking at whether or not the 2 data sets are comparable. And we can use the function SNS KDE plot. So let's start with the box plot. What can we see in terms of the severity? Daniela, can we use concat instead? Yes, I believe so. I believe so. Even in there are several ways that you can merge data sets or data frames in Python. So let's start commenting on the in-study versus out-of-study distributions of maximum severity. What do we observe? Yes. Nicholas, are you sure that you have loaded the website on the correct directory? Notice that also we have much larger variability for the out of study. Yes, we do have some outliers for the in-study group. So we have very few cases of inmates with high severity crimes. So definitely there is a difference between these 2 groups. And now let's look at at the density plot for each one of the values. So we are going to compare for each possible value of maximum severity, we are going to compare the distribution of for the in-study versus out-of-study. As we can see, in blue, we have the curve for the in-study data, okay? And for the out-of-study data, we have yellow, okay? And as you can see, only category 3 is relatively comparable. Category 2 and 1, we can see that the in-study component have much higher concentration. And for 4 and 5, the out-of-study component has higher concentration. Matteo, should we see if the two groups are statistically significant way, or just look at the box plot are different by the eye? Well, when you are performing exploratory data analysis, the analysis is exploratory and is not inferential. So we are just looking at a qualitative assessment that can lead us, of course, to get some insight. All of this should be tested statistically, though, in order to have the answer to the question is, are these differences statistically different? Okay. For instance, if you're interested in the difference between means, you might want to look at a type of t-test or something similar. If you want to instead compare a distribution, you might look at things like Kolmogorov-Smirnov test and so on. Andres, could be better plotting a violin graph. Yeah, I like violin graphs. They are a good alternative to box plots. I also like very much this type of graphs about distributions. Omar, the Anderson-Darling test. Yes, that's another great test for comparing distributions. There are also some multivariate versions for the Anderson-Darling test when you have a multivariate distribution. In this case, we are looking at univariate. So we can see that the distribution of max severity is shifted to the right among non-study participants. That is, criminals convicted of less severe crimes were more likely to enroll in the study. So there you have it. Now, compare the distributions of the remaining variables for in-study versus out-of-study. Also, look at the distribution in the sentence gap, sentence time minus sentence served. So we can start looking at this. So this is the density plot for the sentence time. We can see that they are fairly overlapping. However, the out of group tends to have a little bit more mass on the tail of the distribution here. So a little bit more skewed towards longer sentence times. Again, we knew that there was a correlation between sentence time and chances of not recommitting the same crime. So we do see a difference here. You can see kind of like, the gray curve here is supposed to be the yellow, right? The gray area is the intersection area. Yeah, the gray, John, the gray area is the intersection where the blue and the yellow curves intersect. So you can see that here the blue is not intersecting with the yellow, and you can see that there are more cases with smaller sentence times. This is even more clear for the sentence served. We can see that the outside of the study participants, they have higher sentence served. So probably they were not on good behavior, they were not eligible for parole early enough. But also it can be an issue of the fact that on average, they had a little bit longer sentences, okay? And then finally, we look at the sentence gap between in study and out of study, and it's actually strikingly similar, okay? So this is actually a variable that seems to be really similar. Except perhaps, right here, it seems like there is a small difference in peak. Another tool that we can use is the QQ plot for the gap distributions if we are not satisfied about the density plot, because you cannot quite see the differences. They are very, very close. If we show a QQ plot of the gap distribution, we can see that the right tail lies below the 45-degree line, indicating that the right tail of the in-study population is larger than the out-of-study population. This suggests that those with a large gap, so those released before the full sentence was served, were more likely to enter the study. And this is something that we had already inspected before with a simpler type of analysis. So another thing that we should consider in this example is the following: that in the out-of-study part of the analysis, we are including both participants that, not participants, we are including prisoners that might have joined the program if they were given a chance. And at the same time, the out-of-study group has an overrepresentation of those inmates that were not likely to join the program to begin with. And the reason was that they were given a chance, but they refused the chance. So we have to be a little bit careful in terms of that bias. And this is why it's so important to determine a matching group in order to actually minimize this sort of bias. Hernando is asking, what is the definition of quantiles? We can look at the plot. So remember, here we are looking at the distribution of the sentencing gap. So the variable that we are considering is the time sentenced minus the time served. So this would be the amount of time that still they need to serve, technically. So that's the variable, and it's in months. Okay. The quantiles here, they are looking at the number of months. Let's say this is the first. This is untransformed, right? So if the variables had the same distributions, so let's say the 25th percentile was the same for both populations, or the median was the same for both populations, all the points would be on a 45-degree line. Okay, so when we see, so these are the theoretical quantiles. The theoretical quantiles, if the distributions were equal, they would be all in the 45-degree line. However, what we are seeing here is that on the in-study group, we are observing less, a smaller, because it's underneath the 45-degree line, we are observing a smaller sentencing gap. While for the out-of-study gap, for the out-of-study, that's larger. That suggests that those with a large gap are the ones that are released way before the full sentence was served. So they are more likely to enter the study. So in the study, remember, we have a higher concentration of people that had still a long time to go before their sentence was served, and they were probably released because of good behavior. And we were discussing the implications of this psychological type of behavior by saying, well, if somebody has already on their mind that they do not want to go back to jail, not only they are more likely to enter the study, but they are also more likely to be successful. at staying out of jail. Those are months, 200, 300, 400 months. Those are months. So remember that we have maximum severity. Most of the, notice that the higher concentration of points, okay, it's right at the beginning, right? That means that the majority of the people, they had smaller sentences, but however, we have some outliers. Here we have data that are above 400 months. So we have over 30 years, the sentence. Santiago, I don't understand the outcomes. It's not reasonable that untreated persons have higher reoffended mean. Oh yes, that would be completely would be completely reasonable. But however, what we are saying is that the rate of success, once we take into account matching, once we match against the national, let's say, level, because we are taking prisoners from both jails, we are seeing that the program would be only reduce the recidivism from 60% to 55%. So it will not be that effective. That's what we are claiming. Andres, is it similar to a scatter plot? Yes and no. Well, yes, it's scatter plot for quantiles, yes. You typically see the QQ plot when you're trying to analyze whether or not your distribution is normal, and you would have in one of the axes the quantiles of the normal distribution, and in the x-axis the quantiles of your variable, and basically you want to see the parts where they depart from each other. So it's a tool to compare distributions. It's a tool to say, okay, whenever we see points that are outside or far away from the red line, that's the point where that distribution is winning. So here what we are saying is that the points are more skewed towards the in-study group. Oh, Mauricio, I completely agree that a reduction from 60 to 55% might still be important. However, keep in mind that it comes with intervals and with costs. That is it 5% the target that you were trying to achieve, or is it something more? And of course, you know, this has a lot to do with the initial goal of the study. I completely agree that if 5% was guaranteed and the cost was reasonable, probably it would be a problem that would be worth to implement. So what we have noticed, though, is that, you know, without taking into account matching, the reduction was not 5%, it was 12.5%. So we had about 7% of additional effect that was not due to the study itself, but it was because of the selection bias. So the study looked promising on the study population. However, the study population was conditioned by the fact that it was not randomized. After we adjust for the factors, like the length of sentence, then the sentence served, education, and so on, the program no longer appeared to be as effective. And the matching here was conducting using minimization of the Euclidean distance between covariates. So what are the major takeaways from this exercise? And by the way, this is not supposed to be like a fully developed analysis of this data set. There are many more variables that should be taken into consideration. And this is also one of the reasons why we cannot take at face value something that gives such a small effect, because there are many variables that we are not controlling for. geographic location, sex, type of crime, and so on. So there are many other factors that we should consider, and this is why 5% is probably something that we should make us a little careful. John is asking, is this case a kind of policy quantitative impact assessment? Absolutely, absolutely. Because here you are trying to evaluate how much a change in policy would lead to a change in immeasurable societal outcomes, in this case, recidivism. So the major takeaways from this case are the following. Sampling and treatment assignment methodology are very important. And they are very important, and they encourage you to be very prudent. Because if you are not careful, then you might end up doing type 1 error. And type 1 error, remember, is finding something significant when it's really not significant, which is the worst type of error that we always want to minimize. At the same time, even when you don't find a strong effect, you still might be led to interesting correction factors. For instance, in this case, we learned that people who responded well to the program were inmates that had served a small part of their sentence and that they were already eligible for parole. So perhaps programs that would encourage from the very beginning people to behave well in jail, to be released early, to show them that there are pathways outside of jail, perhaps they can be just as successful as a program that would happen in transition after they are eligible for parole. We also learned that matching is important to reduce the effect of impossibility of randomization. It's conceptually a simple approach, because what you are saying is we need to make groups more comparable. How do we do that? By creating a treatment group and a control group that are formed by similar type of individuals. Typically, we have a larger control group where we can borrow, so it's easier to actually build these groups. Now, one thing that we are not considering, though, is that when you normalize and when you calculate a distance, you are not considering which variable are more important. You might be matching according to a variable that is not really that informative. So what typically is done before you do matching is establishing which one of the covariates are actually important, okay? And only after covariates are selected, then you go and perform matching. So many times this is done in a conjoint approach that involves some regression analysis, some logistic regression analysis, because one of the questions could be, which ones of these variables are important to predict the risk of recidivism? And the pool of variables that you might be considering might be much larger. And then maybe you want to weight your matching. And so at that point, you will learn about propensity score. The propensity score will be kind of a matched type, a weighted type of match that will say, okay, I want to calculate a distance that doesn't just consider all the variables, but is also considering them according to their respective weight. So simple matching of this type is still kind of a raw type of mechanism. And then several types of distances can be used. And it will really depend on case by case and how sensitive they are to the type of weight structure that you want to assign, and how sensitive they are to the objective variable. So there are many other things that need to be explored. This was more of a toy example just to get you acclimated. So there is some mathematics notation that, we could have spent a few more minutes, but honestly, it requires much more than that to define, what a norm is, what transposition is, and so on. So it would be good to, if you want to really grasp all the technical details and how linear algebra can help you avoiding the loops, to go back and revisit this type of material. And so I'd be happy to, since we have a couple of minutes still left, I'll be happy to look at your questions. The reoffend mean after matching is just for the untreated population, both treated and untreated. Well, no, it would be a prediction based on, like, the both treated and untreated, of course. In the last plot, the word quantiles are related to percentiles. Yes, basically we will have to. There is another way that you can do actually the QQ plot, is by selecting like the actual distributions, and of course then it would be in percentage. Wilson, will there be a reduction in recidivism if the proposed program were to be widely adopted? Yes, it's possible. And it's possible that the reduction would be on the order of about 5%. Yeah, this is a class that, this is a case that contains a lot of heavy material, but the important part is that, at the first glance, you talk about for about an hour, we look at the concept and whether or not, remember, we started with the goal of comparing two groups, and we said, well, randomization can be very effective when we saw the example about the promotion. We started with randomization there, right? And it was effective in determining if it was if it would lead to more customers. And we actually found a small impact, but it was statistically significant. In this case, we have not done yet an analysis, a statistical analysis to determine whether or not that 5% is significant. We just went qualitatively and say, okay, if we compare the effect of the program on the treatment group without matching, what we would get would be a reduction of about 5%, 12%, which we said, okay, well, that seems substantial. However, after looking at the percentages within the population that had the possibility of reoffending and matching them against the general population, we found that that rate dropped from 12% to about 5%. And the reason for doing matching is in order to avoid the confounding effect that some of the characteristics can have. In this case, we have seen that the major confounding effects were on the fact that certain subjects were more likely to volunteer. So the volunteer mechanism was in direct opposition with randomization. So it was a problem of confounding. Yes, I will be able to. I will be happy to provide some of the. There is a book by Imbens and Rubin about causal inference that you might want to check. And I will actually talk to the people at Correlation One if they have some additional case material about causal inference. But you will be seeing more cases, I'm sure, about this, because this is a very introductory class. Angristan Evans, I don't have that book, but I saw it before, Viviana. Yeah, Oscar is presenting the work of Donald Rubin, yeah, which is the author of the book that I was mentioning with Imbens. So Viviana, the resource that you are providing about in econometrics about before and after analysis and quasi-experimental design is one example of trying to get causal effects. And yeah, so definitely econometrics has given a lot of attention to this type of analysis, especially for project evaluation when you are trying to assess the efficacy of an intervention project. You do this in economic development countries when you go and let's say, okay, well, I go to this developing country and we introduce this program that's supposed to improve practices in agriculture or in commerce. Are we seeing an improvement on the impact? And then, of course, you can try to measure this. All right, so let's take another break. Now, I think we are in time for break. We should reconvene to talk about something completely different in about 10-15 minutes. Thank you all. Thank you for your attention.